and some faculty members have also joined. They are going to join very soon. Dr. Rajesh Kumar from Professor Rajesh Kumar from Amritsar University here. He has shown a lot of interest, so he would also be joining most probably very soon. So we'll begin the session.
Yeah, a lot of names.
Swati, we can start.
Yeah, should I start?
Yes.
Okay. So on behalf of the Departments of Political Science, DAV Postgraduate College and Vasanta College for Women, Varanasi, I extend a very warm welcome to our respected guests, to the faculty members, the students, to the third technical session of the ongoing collaborative workshop on conflict resolution and peace research. Dear students, since the last 2 days, we have been deliberating on various aspects of peace research. We all know that conflicts are universal. We cannot escape conflicts in a human society. Peace research focuses on understanding conflicts with a view to diminish them. One of the major reasons of conflict is lack of governance, or what is called governance deficit. Today we have with us Dr. Bibhu Prasad Routray to deliver his talk on this issue of governance deficit and conflicts. And he would be doing so with different examples from South Asia. Dr. Routray heads an independent research forum called Mantraya in Goa. Mantraya focuses on making constructive contributions in the realm of strategy, innovation, and alternatives. It brings out analytical reports on various issues of national and international importance. But most importantly for you all, Mantraya has an internship program for the youth too. In past, Dr. Routray has served as Deputy Director in the National Security Council Secretariat of Government of India, also as the Director of Institute of Conflict Management, ICM, Guwahati, Assam. He was also a visiting research fellow at the South Asia program of the ACE Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. Dr. Routray specializes in decision-making, governance, counterterrorism, force modernization, intelligence reforms, foreign policy, and dissent articulation issues in South Asia and also in Southeast Asia. His writings, based on his projects and extensive field research experiences in Indian conflict theaters of the northeastern states and the left-wing extremism affected areas, have appeared in a wide range of academic and policy journals. Now, without delay, I invite Dr. Routray to deliver his talk today on ungoverned spaces and conflicts, South Asian experiences. Dr. Routray, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. One final confirmation. I am audible to everybody?
Yes, you are.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for that lengthy introduction. Thank you, Vasanta College for Women and DAB PG College, Varanasi, for the opportunity to share some of my thoughts on a subject which I've been learning or trying to learn for past couple of decades. So I'll bring in all my experience and all my learning till date to just not to take part in the ongoing online workshop, but also I have also a vested interest in making students who are listening to me today, to make them interested in this area called terrorism research. It's not a very sort of popular area of study in the country, in spite of the fact that we have been affected by various strands of terrorism, extremism, political violence for the past several decades. So I'd be really happy if some of you show a little bit of interest and try to pursue this as a career option. This is a very lucrative career option. I must guarantee you. Obviously the benefits will not come very instantly to you, but if you stay put in this particular area, this is a very sort of fulfilling area of research that you can spend your life on. You'll remain a student all through your life. You can never be an expert in this because your learning has to be updated till yesterday. If you are not sort of ingrained or conceptualized what happened till yesterday, you're completely out of date. So that's the beauty of this. Again, this is not an independent area of research. It brings in elements of political science, public administration, history, philosophy, psychology, sociology, everything into it, and make you understand or helps you to make people understand what are the challenges of terrorism. So that's my interest in accepting this invitation to speak, and also to share my knowledge. Uh, so without any further delay, let me sort of start sharing my PowerPoint presentation. Uh, all right, is this visible to you?
Yes.
All right, thank you. So I'm speaking today on ungoverned spaces and conflict, the South Asian experience. Now, let's begin by talking about some kind of a theoretical framework, of a framework of analysis. How do you understand the relationship between conflict and governance? What's the link? Now, there can be variety of sources for the conflicts. When I say conflict, I'm mostly focusing on terrorism, extremism, insurgency, that kind of thing. So the sources of conflicts are primarily to do with the contrasting desires of human beings. A particular human being's desire is extremely different from the desire of another fellow human being within that particular society or across societies. So, conflicts have primarily occurred over resources or the well being or idea of life or people demanding separate homelands for themselves, that they are comfortable in a particular surrounding and they're very uncomfortable outside that kind of area. So they want homelands for themselves or for people who bear the same kind of thought. And it's not a new phenomenon, it's happened over centuries, even in the earliest form societies, this kind of a trend was there. Now, all of you are teachers and students of political science, so I'll try to bring in some kind of things you're familiar with. Like Thomas Hobbes in his uh, very famous book called Leviathan, he talks about the life of a man being solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. He basically is referring to without to a situation where there are no laws to govern the relationship between human beings. And if there are no laws to govern our society, we essentially will become a society which is fighting within itself, among itself. Basically, to say that without laws, men will fight and kill one another. So that's the idea of a society without laws. The fact that conflict is permanent, that a society will always have some amount of conflict. We are aiming at not a zero sum conflict or not a society which is completely out, a society where conflict is completely absent, but a society where the government or the state can manage conflicts. So Karl Marx referred to that. He said, society is in a state of perpetual conflict because resources are limited. There are too many people to share or fight for those kind of resources. So on these kind of ideas, the formation of the earliest state had this typical objective of managing the conflicts of the interest of human beings, both within civilizations, within communities, and also between communities. Now, how do we manage this? A society which will be able to manage this well will have to be based on its ability to form and allow viable institutions to perform. That's what Kautilya talked about. Kautilya talked about in his Arthasastra, establishment of good institutions is the primary thing for attainment of prosperity. So across continents, political philosophers, you can draw them from other philosophers also, but the essential idea that a society must have certain kind of laws and there has to be institutions to govern and implement those laws. Only then that the society will be able to manage conflicts which are perpetual in any event. Now let's go to the next slide. Now there are various debates about what the purpose or the objective of a government. Now I try to summarize them into 4 points. One, physical security for its citizens, both from external sources and also from the contending force within a society. We are talking about peace within India when different communities don't fight among themselves, and also peace from external aggression from our neighboring countries or beyond that. That's the physical security part. There has to be legitimate political institutions. It is the purpose of the government to establish this kind of institutions and also to let them function effectively so that these political institutions are enabled to formulate public policies so that people are restrained from harming one another. So, in a sense, it means that there has to be rule of law in a society. Without rule of law, we'll go back to what Thomas Hobbes said, a society in which everybody is out to kill one another. That's a very sort of exaggerated notion of security, but it's true because human nature is actually when the resources are limited, human nature is to grab the resources and not really care for what happens to his fellow human being. That's the reality, and that's remained unchanged over centuries. Economic management, the third purpose of the government. It has to regulate the market. It has to ensure that the market is it functions in a particular way that few people do not really observe the benefits of the market. It, the most ideal situation, it doesn't happen everywhere. We know in our society, in our state, uh, uh, resources are observed by a few people. The bottom of the society or the bottom of the country is still poverty ridden and is still without much of resources. But that's the ideal part. The state is expected or the government is expected to ensure that there is economic management of the resources and people are privy to the kind of resources that are available. It's not the equitable distribution, but it has to be on the basis of just principles and promote general social welfare. When you bring in the concepts of education, or health, or infrastructure, that's the function of the state. Although the state is withdrawing from this kind of areas over time, but this is an ideal thing that the state has to ensure that the people who are part of the state have access to these kind of instruments of welfare. So that's the purpose of the state. Now, I'm basically moving to what my theme is, the ungoverned space. So what happens if there is no government? Obviously, the purposes for which the government exists are not fulfilled. That means that there is an ungoverned space, or if some people find it sort of deserving, saying like uh, to say that a particular space is ungoverned. They call it a partially governed space. Doesn't really matter. You can use that kind of a term also. Or it's a differently governed space. So terrorism related research talks about allows this kind of various connotations or various expressions to come in. It's up to you who you want to use, but the main They all mean the same, which means that not all areas of a country are uniformly administered. It can be historical, it can be the lack of intent or capacity on part of the central government. The resources of the country are not equally distributed. The reasons can be the state has limited resources, or it can be political reasons or capacity. Or all regions of the country do not have a say in the framing of laws that govern them. In our country, you will see that various states send different numbers of people, representatives to the Union Parliament. Uh, Uttar Pradesh sends the maximum, so that's the most politically relevant uh, state in the country. The states of the Northeast send barely 2 members to the Indian government parliament. That's why their say in the affairs of the country is extremely limited. Nobody listens to them. But that's the way it is. So the absence of governance basically percolates down to this kind of problems, which affects the not only the capacity of the government to govern, but also creates a lot of windows and opportunities for the anti-state or the non-state actors to perform and perpetuate themselves. Now, when I'm sort of uh, mostly referring to the historical or the political regions for the creation or the existence of an ungoverned state, not all ungoverned spaces are historical in nature. It can be of recent origin also. They can be formed due to an abrupt regime change, which means that, for example, Iraq, uh, when United States and its allies invaded Iraq, they toppled the regime of Saddam Hussein. They engaged and destroyed the Iraqi army, and they brought in a new regime. Now, that new regime was completely incapable of administering the way Saddam Hussein used to administer the state, which meant that the reach of the particular government, the new government, is extremely limited in terms of governance. It created a lot of ungoverned spaces all around the country, which were taken advantage of groups like the Islamic State or the Al Qaeda, and the results are still out there in the open. It is still affecting a lot of people around the world. The same can be talked about Syria. The same can be talked about Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a case study that I'll bring in a little later. But the basic thing is the creation or the existence of a ungoverned space can be due to historical reasons, and it also can be due to an abrupt political or regime change initiated by an external actor. So that's something which must keep in mind. Now, what are the manifestations of the absence of governance? Which means that if there is no governance, or there is only partial governance, or there is something called the alternate forms of governance, when the government is not present in a particular territory, what happens? What results out of that kind of thing? So that essentially becomes zones that lay beyond the reaches of the central government. The central government doesn't really know what is happening in those areas. There is absolutely no or skeletal, very limited presence of administrative or policing structures. Why I am bringing in this policing aspect is for the sake of the subject that I'm trying to cover here. Police or the agents of law and order implementation are vital to the functions of a state. They are not just a cohesive arm of the state, they also are vital in terms of protecting the law and order situation and ensuring that the services of the state percolates down to the bottom list, to the most sort of uh, basic and grassroots level. So, in the absence of governance, you have absolutely no administrative or policing structure in a particular area. So, as a result, that particular area becomes a safe haven for extremists who carry out the recruitment and training activities in those areas, because the government simply doesn't know what's happening in those areas. those areas all also become vulnerable to violent radicalization and extremism. Basically, if the government is not there, it is the rule of the non-state actors in those areas. So it becomes extremely important for the government of a particular country to have domination over an area. In the absence of domination, those areas simply lapse into the control of the extremists. And from a state point of view, a state security point of view, the final point that I'm highlighting here, intelligence collection become the Herculean task. Now, there are two aspects of intelligence collection. One is called human or human intelligence, and the other is called technical intelligence. Now, human intelligence is something in which the intelligence agencies, for example, the Intelligence Bureau or the RAW, have human presence, have the agents or informers in a particular area to give information to the state about the happenings in that particular area. Now, if the state is not present and if the area is under the control of the extremists, it is simply not possible for the intelligence bureau or the RAW to have its agents or the informers in that particular area. So there is effectively no intelligence coming out of the area to the government. The government simply doesn't know what's happening in the area. Or there is, in the absence of that kind of a capacity, when the government cannot put informers or agents in an extremist affected area, it resorts to something called the TechInt or the technical intelligence, which means that it will send a drone, it will tap into the internet sources, it will tap into social media sources, it will employ gadgets, satellites to get information out of those. Now, those are useful, but tech-in or technical intelligence collection is extremely error-prone because a machine cannot really distinguish between a civilian and an extremist. So I'll give you examples of this in the following slides. But that's the problem an ungoverned state manifests in itself, that it is simply not possible for a government to get information out of a particular area where it is not present. Now, let's go to the three case studies that I'm trying to highlight. First is the Afghanistan border. Now, all these three studies that I'll bring in now are examples of the ungoverned spaces and how they were exploited by different extremist outfits, terrorist outfits to their advantage, and how the impact of that kind of a scenario was extremely severe for the security situation in the neighboring areas and also the world beyond. Now, the Appspa border, or the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. The British ruled the entire Indian subcontinent at one point of time. When they left, they created these boundaries which are contested, which led to the creation of different nation states in South Asia. But at the same time, the same boundaries divided communities, divided homes, divided ethnicities. So these artificial boundaries, or the boundaries that were drawn between or to create different states in South Asia, have remained contested till date. One such boundary is called the Durand Line, which was created sometime 1893 by the British. It created the country of Afghanistan and the country of Pakistan. Much later, the Durand Line, when it came into existence, it divided what we understand as the Pashtun population, who inhabit the land and who are divided among Pakistan and Afghanistan. So the Pashtun people do not really understand the Durand Line. They don't recognize the Durand Line. They don't accept the legality of the Durand Line. They vie for something called the Pashtunistan or the idea of a homeland for the Pashtun people. Now, some of you who have read newspapers, who have read books on Taliban, would know that the Taliban are basically comprised of the Pashtun people. Now, after the 9/11 attacks, when the United States intervened and invaded Afghanistan, it dislodged the Taliban government, which was there in power from 1996. So, as a result of this military offensive, the Taliban simply left Afghanistan and crossed over to Pakistan. When I say Pakistan, they crossed over the Durand line and came to this particular area, which is shaded in green, on the other side, in the side of the Pakistani state. Now, that particular area was always historically an area which had very little control, which had witnessed very little control of the central Pakistani government. That effectively, till date, remains an ungoverned territory between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And it was very easy for Taliban and also the Al Qaeda, who have moved out of Afghanistan and settled down in Pakistan's ungoverned territory across the Durand line, to establish a parallel government there. They established their shuras or the territorial councils in that particular area. They trained suicide bombers who wreaked havoc in Afghanistan. They recruited their cadres. They organized the armed campaign against the Afghan state and also the international community who were trying to fight the Taliban. So the ungoverned space within that particular area became perhaps arguably the single most factor why the Taliban was able to come back to the power center in Kabul in August 2021. So, for the first time, the Americans talked about the Pak region as an ungoverned territory. It was highlighted by Hillary Clinton, who was the Secretary of State that time. But there was a historical tradition, as I mentioned, that this particular area was always out of the purview of the central government, both in Afghanistan and also from Pakistan. They called it the Yagistan. Yagistan is the land of the free. Only the people who are free from everybody, from the central rule of Afghanistan and the central rule of Pakistan, belong to the territory of Pashtunistan or the Yagistan. So it has a romantic notion that I belong to this land of free, but from a state security point of view, both from the states, the Pakistani state, and also from the Afghan state, that became a terrible security nightmare. And that particular region, the inability of the international community, the US and the NATO forces, to control that area, to bring in state security in that particular area, became the single most important factor for what happened to Afghanistan last year. So we have the new Afghanistan when the Taliban has taken over in August 2021. Now, anybody who's been reading the newspapers, you read about the Taliban atrocities, its violence against minorities, its violence against women, how women have been banished into the four corners of their houses, they're not being able to attend schools, they have been banished from uh, workplaces. The minorities in Afghanistan are also not a part of the government anymore. The former employees of the civilian government in Afghanistan have left the country. There is poverty, there is economic impoverishment in Afghanistan. So, Afghanistan, maybe the Taliban is showing to the world that they are victorious forces over the US, but their ability to govern the country is completely contingent. It may appear to you when you read the newspaper that the Taliban is actually the new rulers of Afghanistan and who can kill at their whims and fancies. We can administer justice, but they have struggled in the last 7 months to administer any form of governance in that country, which means that vast regions of Afghanistan today have already become ungoverned spaces, where the ability of the Islamic Emirate, the Taliban call themselves now, the Islamic Emirate's ability to govern the country, to be present in the territories of this vast country are completely limited. So that, in addition to the Taliban's historical linkages with a variety of terrorist forces, including the groups who are operating in Kashmir, like Lashkar-e-Toiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, or the group that functions within Pakistan, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, the TTP, have become emboldened. That's created a lot of anxieties, not just within India. The central government and the intelligence agencies in this country think that as a result of what happened in Afghanistan in August 2021 and after that, there is a possibility that the level of violence, the level of terrorism in Kashmir is going to go up, going to increase. The same anxieties are also there present in Pakistan, where the TTP, which is in nexus with the Taliban in Afghanistan, has started increasing the level of violence. The same anxieties are there in China as well, which think that the Uyghur Muslim insurgents will be emboldened and they'll be able to carry out fresh attacks within China. That's why the Chinese are trying to have some kind of understanding cooperative mechanism with the Taliban to control the Uyghurs. India, of course, is out of Afghanistan. It has lost much of its leverage in Afghanistan, and it doesn't really know how to respond to a situation in which the terrorists will become uh, active again and will be able to exploit the ungoverned areas that are available to them in Afghanistan. So that's the case study on Afghanistan and the ungoverned spaces there. So that's the case study number one. The second case study is from our own country. Is about the left-wing extremism or the Naxal or the Maoist violence in this particular country. I'm sure most of you are aware of this particular problem in this particular country. At sometime back in 2005 or 2006, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh talked about or termed Naxalism or the left-wing extremism as the biggest internal security challenge for the country. That was a time when the CPI Maoist, the Communist Party of India Maoist, was influential or present in 1/3 of the country's territory. That meant that the government's ability to reach out to more than 230 districts in a country where at that particular time it was close to 630 or 640 districts. So 1/3 of the country's territory was under the control of the Naxalites or the CPI Maoists, and the government had very little ability to reach out to those areas. Naxalism or left-wing extremism, contrary to what we hear as urban Naxals or that kind of use by the term by various people, Naxalism always remained a rural phenomenon. Although it affected a variety of states, not a single incident of Naxal violence ever happened in the capital of a particular state. For example, Chhattisgarh was the worst affected and still is the worst affected Naxal affected state in the country. But till date, not a single incident of Naxal violence has taken place in Raipur. Not a single incident of violence has taken place in Bhubaneswar in Odisha or in Ranchi in Jharkhand or in Patna in Bihar. It always remained a rural phenomenon. But the sense of security as we have, or the people in the capital may have, because of this, that Naxal violence is happening only in the remote part of the country, is not really a sort of source of satisfaction for the government, which is trying to reach out to the remote areas. At that particular time, at the peak of its violence, now of course it's drastically reduced, but now when it really was at its peak, CPI Maoist had about 40,000 armed cadets. There was a saying that in areas of Naxal violence or Naxal dominance, the Naxals were roaming in uniform and the police were in their civilian clothes because they did not want to be identified as policemen because they will be killed and attacked. That was the time, you'll find it hard to believe, government took a conscious decision to take out the weapons from the police officials from the police stations located in the remote areas, because they knew that if the police persons have weapons, the Naxals are going to come and take those weapons away. So imagine a situation in which there are police stations. The police stations are expected to establish law and order, protect civilian lives, but they have no weapons. So basically, their presence was token and it amounted to nothing. In the absence of the police or the absence of security, there was this phenomenon of ghost teachers and ghost doctors, which meant that there are hospitals, but there are no doctors, or the doctors will go and be there for half an hour and come back running for his life and spend the entire week in a safe place in the district headquarters or something. The schools will not have teachers. The teachers will share their salary with a particular person who will portray himself as a teacher. So the children of that particular area will not have any kind of education in those schools. So in that kind of a situation in which the state was hardly present, it became a strategy on part of the Naxals also to ensure that this kind of a state of affair is perpetuated, continues. So that whenever there was an attempt by the government to establish a school, build a road, establish a health center, they'll go and destroy those kind of facilities. They ensured that a particular an attempt by the government to stop the area being labeled as ungoverned is defeated. The area must remain ungoverned for perpetuity because that acted to their advantage. I talked about human before. So to ensure that there is no human intelligence going back to the government, they killed the police informants or the civilians who were paid a little bit of money to give information about the Naxals to the government. And this is a phenomenon which still continues. Ungoverned spaces also can be described from the phenomenon of what we call as the police population ratio or the police density. Police population ratio is something when you count the number of policemen per 100,000 men or 1 lakh men. How many police personnel are present in a particular area or a particular state per 1,000 men or 1,000 persons. Now, in 2010, when Naxalism or the activities of the CPI Maoist was at its peak, the police population ratio for Delhi, I'll give you an example. In Delhi, National Capital Territory, Delhi was 403. That means that for every 1 lakh population, there are 403 police personnel available. Compare that to Chhattisgarh, 179. Jharkhand, 151. Bihar, only 64. Orissa, 106. So it was beyond the ability of these policemen to be able to defeat or counter the challenge posed by the Nazis. There's something on the police density. How many policemen are present per 100 square kilometer area? With the national average, Delhi, for example, in 2010, Delhi being a small place geographically, had 4,980 policemen present per 100 square kilometer area. Compare that to the Naxal affected states. Chhattisgarh, only 30 policemen per 100 square kilometer area. Jharkhand, 58, Bihar, 65, Orissa, 27. So, in effect, all these territories where there was absolutely no state presence, and that affected not just the intelligence collection but also the state's ability to implement development schemes, carry out, build roads, build hospitals, build schools, and the alienation of the people, the feeling of the people, tribal people, that the state doesn't do anything for us, continue. That emboldened, that acted to the advantage of the natives. One of the primary examples of this ungoverned territory is this territory called Abojmar in Chhattisgarh. Now, in Chhattisgarh, the tribals speak something called a language called Gondi. In Gondi language, Abojmar translates to Abuj Mart or the unknown territory, a territory about which we have no idea. Now, it is a vast territory of 4,400 square kilometers in Chhattisgarh's Bastar area. By the security forces referred to this as mini Pakistan. Why mini Pakistan? Because it's an enemy territory. It's an enemy territory where the CPI Maoist was present. It had its central leadership present there. It had its training grounds there. It was arms manufacturing units there. So, and it was a place where the security forces simply could not enter. Now, Abojmar is an area even the British couldn't even enter. There was no revenue survey done in Abojmar since the British left the country. Since then, the government has tried to go into Abojmar to counter the CPA Maoist, which is still present, but still now it's been unable to do so. It's simply unimaginable that at the heart of India, there is a 4,400 square kilometer area in which the writ of the state is completely absent. And at a time when the problem of left-wing extremism has reduced drastically. And there are similar ungoverned territories in other states also, smaller in territory, but they provide the same kind of safe haven sanctuary to the extremists. Some of you who can read Hindi have brought out these two news clippings from different sources which talks about today's Abojmar, the actual status of Abojmar. I'll not attempt reading in Hindi, but if you read these headlines of these two news items, you'll have a rough idea about what happens in this particular ungoverned territory and how it helps the extremists till date. The third case study is about the insurgencies of the Northeast. Northeast, as you know, consists of 8 states. The state of Sikkim was a late entrant. It is the 8th state, but barring Sikkim, insurgency or extremism was present in all the 7 states of the Northeast. It was a legacy of the British because the British administered the Northeast as a different zone. It was inhabited mostly by tribal people, so the British thought that it is easy and convenient to keep this area out of the British administration so that they do not become a part of the national struggle for independence. So it was administered. The tribal councils or the tribals were allowed to have their own administrative structures and systems to uh, administer their own region. That seemed to have allowed the tribals of the Northeast or the ethnic communities of the Northeast to have a feeling of independence. They always thought that they are not a part of India. So their idea of independence clashed uh, violently with the concept of nation state after India came out of the British control in 1947. The Nagas appealed to Mahatma Gandhi. They appealed to the first Prime Minister of the country, Jawaharlal Nehru, that they should be set free because Nagas are not a part of India. The same thing happened to Manipur, to Mizoram, to other states. When the Indian state were primarily focusing on building the country from the scratch after the British left, it seemed to have also perpetuated the legacy of the British by neglecting the region. Whenever there used to be a rebellion or an insurgency, the Indian army was to be sent, and that's it. So the alienation of the people, their sense of independence persisted over time. So there was till the early 1990s, there was underdevelopment, there was festering of ungoverned spaces. At one point of time, there are 130 insurgent groups in the Northeast. Insurgency was referred to as the cottage industry of the Northeast. It was a region which insurgencies benefited because of the porous international borders with Bhutan, with China, with Myanmar and Bangladesh. These are the four countries that surround the Northeast. So there was large-scale extortion, abduction, killing. Situation has improved, just like the left-wing extremism situation has improved. But still, at least 15 to 20 outfits still exist and carry on their activities. And stabilization of the Northeast, ending the ungoverned spaces in the Northeast is vital for the Indian state because of our Act East policy. When we try to link the economy of the Northeast with the economies of the neighboring Southeast Asia. So unless these ungoverned spaces are administered, governance is restored in those kind of areas, our aim of developing the Northeast or connecting the Indian economy with the South Asian economy will always remain unfulfilled. Okay. Now, what are the problems or the dilemmas that the states face or the governments face about ending or bringing back governance to the ungoverned spaces? It's not typical to India. You can see this as a South Asian perspective or even a global perspective. States have struggled to have a policy that works vis-a-vis the ungoverned spaces. What do we do? What does the state do? Continue the neglect part. Forget the ungoverned spaces as something which cannot be restored, or we try to forcibly integrate them. Bring back administer them, bring back policing, bring back the army. What do we do about it? Then there is something called the chicken and egg dilemma. Which comes first? Shall we bring in the military, stabilize the region, or use development initiatives to end the alienation of people? If you are bringing in the military, which force should be effective? Is it the local police force or the central forces, the paramilitary forces of the army? Who do we use? If you're trying to pump in a lot of money into that region, thinking that availability of the money will change the feeling of alienation of the people, do we consider the fact that the states or those regions, do they have the capacity to absorb the kind of money that's going into the region? Is it really being implemented in the projects that have been identified, or is it only benefiting the contractors, the bureaucrats, and the politicians? If there is a military operation or the security force operation, what do we do about the human rights issues? Because if it's a central force, it is very difficult for the force to be able to distinguish between a civilian and an extremist in that particular area if they're not exposed to the area. For example, if a CRPF personnel from Rajasthan or Uttar Pradesh is deployed in Mizoram and is asked to go after an extremist, he'll find it extremely hard to distinguish who's a civilian and who's an extremist, and may end up killing a civilian. So those kind of problems, those kind of human rights issues have perpetuated extremism in that particular area, not just in the India, but also globally. So there was a UNDP study about Africa recently, in which the respondents, extremists themselves, said that they have joined extremism because of a human rights issue, because a family member of theirs have been killed, or somebody have been raped, or somebody have been sort of ill-treated by the security forces. The states use tech into the technical intelligence gathering gadgets, like drones, for example. Now, what happened in the Appspa area or Afghanistan about the use of the drones? Now, somebody sitting in the Seattle in the US was looking at the particular area in Afghanistan over his TV monitor or computer monitor, and he sees a gathering of people, and some people in that gathering are firing, uh, are firing up in the sky, up in the air. Now, for an American who's sitting thousands of miles away, this may appear to be a extremist congregation or a group of extremists going to attack a particular place, but in actuality, in reality, that can simply be a tribal marriage process. So if you launch a missile on that kind of a gathering, you end up killing civilians and not extremists. The net result is that all those who got killed, their relatives will harbor antipathy towards the Americans, towards the particular state that is in power. Some of them may end up joining the extremists or the militancy of terrorists. So these are the dilemmas of the government. How to end is lack of absence in the particular area. How to go? How do I go in? And there have been no sort of ready-made solutions. So this is my last slide. If this is the problem that states confront or the states have, how do we sort of end this? How do we address the problem of ungoverned spaces and the advantage that they provide to the insurgents or the extremists? Now, I have listed down some. There can be many more, but for the paucity of time, let me sort of elaborate few of these. There has to be a responsive government. The government which is willing and sincere to act to end its lack of presence in a particular area. It also has to realize that there is no quick fix. Something cannot be achieved overnight. There is no one size fit all formula. That this is my formula, I'll apply it in Chhattisgarh, the same thing I'll apply in Afghanistan, the same thing I'll apply in Orissa or Jharkhand, and it'll solve all. That doesn't really happen that way. There has to be a local solution. It has to take into account the tradition, the sensitivities, and the aspirations of the locals. The solution has to emerge from within a particular society. For that, you have to have the involvement of local community, local leaders. You have to address the question or the problem of corruption. You have to address the problem of alienation. There has to be simultaneous acts of development and police action. You cannot wait for the police to liberate an area, only then developmental activities will happen. Then that wait will be in perpetuity. It will never end. And lessening the dependency of the central forces, which means that it has to be a police-led operation. Wherever we have successes in counter-insurgency operations in the country, be it Punjab, Mizoram, Tripura, other places, Andhra Pradesh, it has always been police-led operations. It has never been Indian Army-led operation or central force operation. So these are the few points that one needs to keep in mind to sort of address this problem of ungoverned spaces. So this is where I end. Hopefully we'll have some opportunity to clear doubts if you have any.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Routray. I think the lectures covered a lot of most of the aspects that of governance deficit. You have covered the way some of the most notorious conflicts of our times have a sense of governance as their roots. You call it ungoverned spaces, we call it governance deficit in our syllabus. And you also told us about how the absence of state in these areas have actually led to the non-state actors taking over the spaces, and these are the agents of violence, so they have taken over the spaces. Thank you so much. I'm sure the students must be having a number of questions for you. And Madam Priti is saying, Madam, should we open the floor for question and answer session?
Yes, Swatiji, please. Students are raising hands, so you can start with
Okay. But are there any comments, any questions from the faculty members side? Let's ask the faculty members first.
I think we'll take up the question of the student first, and then at the end.
All right. So we have Seema Yadav, who has raised her hand. Seema, आप अपना सवाल पूछना चाहेंगी बेटे?
Yes, ma'am. Good evening, sir.
आप हिंदी इंग्लिश जिसमें भी कंफर्टेबल हैं, आप उसी में पूछिए.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you. सर एक्चुअली आपने नॉर्थ ईस्ट इंडिया के बारे में डिस्कस किया, तो सर एक डिबेट हमेशा आफ्सपा को लेके चलती है कि आफ्सपा सही है या गलत है. कुछ ग्रुप्स ऐसे हैं जो कहते हैं कि आफ्सपा का यूज जो मिलिट्री है वो गलत तरीके से करती है, बट कुछ लोग दूसरा ग्रुप है जो कहता है कि आफ्सपा नहीं सही है क्योंकि काउंटर इंसर्जेंसी ऐसे के लिए मिलिट्री को उसकी हेल्प लेनी पड़ती है. तो सर आप उसको कैसे देखते हैं? क्या आफ्सपा लगाना सही है या वो गलत है?
और सर और सवाल पूछ ले, एक साथ लेंगे या एक एक करके आप आंसर?
We'll gather few questions, then yeah.
Okay. और कोई सवाल?
Participant may even write in the chat box if you are having problem with network or something. So you may ask your question or write in the chat box also. This is a very interesting topic, and you have such a wonderful resource person, so you should not miss the opportunity.
Yeah. So maybe we should start with this question. Students will come up with more questions. जी, शायद इस सवाल का जवाब हम शुरू करते हैं इससे, फिर आगे.
सीमा, थैंक यू. मैं तो हिंदी में नहीं बोल पाऊंगा, but I'll keep my response simple. देखिए, AFSPA had its relevance. Now, if you know what is AFSPA, Armed Forces Special Powers Act, it was necessary at a time when the army was deployed in the region. Now, for the problems that a particular security force contingent faces in a particular conflict-ridden place, you have to give them some kind of power, some kind of extra authority to act. Now, that authority is required in a point of time when extremism is extremely effective or extremely dominant. अभी का हाल जो नॉर्थ ईस्ट का है, there have been tremendous improvement. There was at one point of time close to 1,000 deaths were occurring in the northeast. आज के दिन में not even 20 deaths occur. So, in my opinion, an enabling provision of like Afspa, Armed Forces Special Powers Act, doesn't have any relevance because for two reasons. One, the intensity of violence has come down, and secondly, the Indian Army or the Assam Rifles or the Central Paramilitary Forces who are deployed in the Northeast have been deployed for decades. So their knowledge about the Northeast is probably as good as the local police. So to give them this kind of a power, which may not be resulting in human rights violation, but affect the sensitivities of the local people, it's a disadvantage to the Indian state. आपके साथ अगर लोग नहीं है, if the people of the state are not with you, if the people still suffer from the sense of alienation, then the Indian state ability to govern or to be relevant to that particular region is being defeated. So मेरे हिसाब से आज के लिए today the Afghan shouldn't be there. It should be sort of withdrawn completely because आपको अगर याद होगा, आपने अगर पढ़ा होगा, back I think in 2006 or 2007 when Dr. Manmohan Singh was in power, he addressed a rally in Imphal saying that I am ensuring that Appspa will be removed within a very short time. That was an assurance given by the Prime Minister. Even then it could not be implemented because there have been vested interests. There have been very powerful vested interests within the Indian Army, within the security force establishment who want the Appspa to remain. Not for operational reasons, but for the reason. But it is no doubt that Appspa is still adding to the sense of alienation of that particular region. So it shouldn't be there, in my opinion.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, we have a question in the chat box. It's from Ashish, and he asks, how can non-state actors play a vital role in solving conflicts in the local areas? And what would be the role of civil society? Is it the same, sir? In the same, sir. Okay, is it the same, sir? Oh, I mean, I don't know. He wants to know the role of civil society.
Okay. Yes, civil society has always played a pivotal role, although the image of the civil society is somewhat contested in various conflict theaters. हम अगर नॉर्थ ईस्ट की बात करें तो there have been civil societies, women groups like the Myra Paibis in Manipur. It translates to the torch bearers of Manipur. These are mothers or women community leaders who come out and rally for peace. There is something called the Naga Mothers Association in Nagaland. There is the church in Nagaland. When you say church, it's not a religious institution, but a very dominant civil society organization, a group, because Nagaland, as you know, is 100% Christian. So the church has played a very important role to bring in ceasefire between the NSC and IAM or the Naga insurgent groups and the Indian state. So in some places where the hold of the civil society is influential, is good, they have been able to play a very delicate and influential role. But at the same time, where the state doesn't really trust the civil society group, the state considers, or when you say state, is basically the intelligence organizations or the police establishment. They think that it's not a civil society organization, it's part of the insurgents. So it basically depends, the influence of a particular civil society organization will depend to what extent both the parties, both the non-state actors and the state actors, allow it to play. If that trust factor is not there, then the civil society's contribution will be very, very minimal. So depending on how the civil society organization or a particular civil society organization has been able to carve out a niche, a place for itself in a particular society, is related to its influence.
Yeah, I think there is another a very important civil society organization in the north is Manipur Gun Survivors Network. That is also very, very effective, playing a very effective role there. I think some more questions. Anu had raised her hand. Anu, do you have a question still? Are you still there?
Yes, ma'am. Am I
Yes.
audible?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir, for this amazing lecture. So I want to ask that in one side, we see that government has declared some disturbed areas in eastern part, and it was started with Naga Hills, and with time it is spread in all the 7 states. And on the other side, we also see that China is also claiming his territory in Arunachal Pradesh and in some areas. So, what will be a balanced step from government side so that our people will also not suffer and we can overcome from the threat of China? Is there any balance possible steps? Thank you, sir.
Okay. Anu, this promulgation of Disturbed Areas Act is a precursor to the implementation of the Appspa. According to the rule, Appspa can be implemented only in area which has been declared as a disturbed area. So the first step that the government takes is to declare a particular area as disturbed area, and then bring in Appspa into that particular area. So that's the way it is. Now, Appspa or the Disturbed Area Act is not implemented in all the states of the Northeast. It is there in particular areas, particular states, mostly in Nagaland, in Manipur, parts of Assam, and parts of Arunachal Pradesh. It is not there in Mizoram. It was there in Tripura. It has been removed, and it is not there in most of Assam. It is not there in Meghalaya as well. So basically, you are referring to two distinct problems. One, what we do with our own territory, our own people. How do we end their sense of alienation? And the second aspect that you're highlighting is how do we deal with the external aggression of China or the Chinese territorial claims over Arunachal Pradesh. Maybe Sikkim, it was there for a long time, not there anymore. But how do we deal with that? So these are two different aspects. Now, how do we end the alienation part is by addressing their sensitivities, by addressing their aspirations, by doing something about the Appspa part, by integrating the area, by bringing in more development. Those kind of aspects is to do with the Disturbed Areas Act or the sense of alienation within the Northeast. Baki, how do we deal with China is a very, very different game. Now, the Chinese aspirations or the Chinese feeling that Arunachal is not a part of India and is a part of China is going to fester. It will always be there. But that's a matter of diplomacy, military action, military preparedness, infrastructure, all that to deal with that kind of thing. There is no ready-made solution. That we can't say that if we develop the border roads or if we have installed a particular government in Arunachal Pradesh, the Chinese claim over Arunachal Pradesh will end. It will not. It's better. It's a matter between the Indian state and the Chinese state, and probably the nuisance that the Chinese state is creating will always be there, because that's the strategy of the Chinese state to sort of create instability within India. That will always be there. But these are the two very distinct problems. They're not really related.
There's some more questions in the chat box. Yeah. One question is about what do you suggest in the case of ungoverned regions of Afghanistan? From where should the first step come? Any international platform, mediation by any other nation, or any local force? That's one question. The other question is about the hijab issue. So these are two different questions.
Let me sort of read out the Afghanistan question first. Okay. All right. So as I mentioned, that in this new Afghanistan, most of the Afghan territory has turned into an ungoverned space. That has created anxieties within the neighboring states that those regions will be exploited by the non-state actors or the terrorist groups to create security situations in say India, in Pakistan, in China. Now, how do we address that? Now, I don't think we'll be able to address that kind of a situation as long as the Taliban are the ruling regime in Afghanistan. The Taliban, as you have discovered in the last 7 to 8 months, are simply unable to govern the territory. They'll never be the legitimate rulers of Afghanistan. So what the international community is trying to do is to work towards an inclusive government in Afghanistan, in which not only the Taliban is power, but elements from the minority community, from the elements from the erstwhile civilian government, the women groups, the other groups are also part of the government. Only then that kind of a government can claim to have the full support of the Afghan people. Unless that kind of a government comes into play, which I think is again a very long shot. It's not going to happen tomorrow or day after. It's going to take time. Or it may not happen at all. So till that time, an inclusive government is in power in Afghanistan. Afghanistan territory will always pose security problem to the neighboring countries. And that's a fact of life. Now,
thank you. The other question is about hijab issue, which is an ongoing problem, conflict. Would you like to take this question, Dr. Routray, actually? This is controversial.
No, I can answer. I have a particular view on this, but is it okay to sort of air my view on this public forum? I think शहाना हम आपस में बात कर लेंगे. But my learned opinion is people must be free to do wear whatever. That's the minimum that the state can ensure. There should be no restriction on part of this. It's not the state's business to dictate what people eat, what people wear, and how people sort of live their life. As long as they're not endangering the security of the state or challenging the sovereignty of the state. Hijab doesn't challenge any of these. So I think whatever has happened is not correct and shouldn't have happened in the first place.
Thank you. Any more questions? Any more questions from students, from respected faculty members? I know Professor Rajesh Kumar has also joined us now. Sir, are you there? Any comment? I think.
Dr. Swati, no comments as such because I joined very late. It will not be very appropriate on my part. I can only congratulate all the organizers, and it is nice to see Dr. Bibhu Routray. I do not know whether he remembers me or not. We were there as batchmates of Smriti Patnaik. So it was nice listening to you, Dr. Bibhu. Hope to listen to your insightful talk in future also. And congratulations to Dr. Swati for organizing these kind of events on a very frequent basis, actually.
Thank you. This event has been organized by 2 colleges together. Vasanta College of Varanasi, Vasanta College for Women, and DAV Postgraduate College. I think Shruti Jha has a question. That would be the last question from the student side we'll take. Shruti? Yeah, please, Shruti. Shruti Jha.
Good evening, all of you. Respected teachers, good evening, sir. Good evening, ma'am, and hello to all my friends. Actually, I wanted to answer on this topic, like you said about hijab, right? So my say is on this, like every school has a uniformity, and you should follow that uniformity basically. एंड एक स्कूल का भी यूनिफॉर्म सिविल कोड होता है. एंड अभी रिसेंटली में उत्तराखंड में पुष्कर धामी सरकार ने यूनिफॉर्म सिविल कोड लेकर आया. सो मेरे हिसाब से एक यूनिफॉर्म सिविल कोड होना चाहिए. एंड इस नाम पे लाइक मैं ये कहने की कोशिश कर रही हूँ दैट एक स्कूल का भी यूनिफॉर्मिटी होता है. एंड वी शुड हम आइडेंटिटी छुपाने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं सर. और आइडेंटिटी जो क्योंकि हम उससे चेहरा ढक रहे हैं. किसी का चेहरा ढकने की बात भी नहीं है. जैसे ओवेसीज का ये कमेंट आया दैट बहुत सारे कमेंट्स आए लाइक बोला उन्होंने बोला कि इस नाम पे जो कॉन्फ्लिक्ट्स हो रहे हैं लाइक पहनने दो, हमारा अधिकार है. बट वी आर ट्राइंग टू हाइड द आइडेंटिटी बेसिकली. और बचपन से ये सिखाया जा रहा है आप हिजाब पहनिए. एवरीवन हैज देयर ओन आइडेंटिटी. बट स्कूल की ये एंड दे आर कमिंग टू स्कूल बेसिकली.